This is the second in spectacles lecture I'm giving this term, and as I've told, it's focused here on the two older Birling characters. There's certainly a feeling in my mind that either of them could come up this year, but also I think the thing with Inspector Calls is sometimes we have to look very tightly for interesting things to come up with. You'll be well aware, any of you who've been to any of these before, that I often talk about the point behind this is to try and think about ways of getting towards level 6, of getting towards conceptual and exploratory answer. And to be able to do that, you have to approach from more than just the obvious thing of Mr. Birling's a bad man, Mrs. Birling's a bad lady. So what I'm taking here to begin with is the idea that what we have is a generation out of time, these two older men. What I mean by that is that I think that Priestley is presenting to us essentially here a play which is an attack on not just this older generation, but on older generations in general, and particularly on the way that older generations get in the way of change, and change that's led by those younger. So my argument for you here today is that this is one of the things that Priestley is trying to show us. Remember, this is a historical play. This is something that Priestley has set at a specific moment in time over 30 years before it was due to be seen and premiered. Therefore, anything that happens in it is attached to that time. He's not commenting on a society that is current. It's a society that's 2 world wars away. So to Priestley, I would argue this generation, the generation of Arthur and Sybil, is to blame for both wars. I think it's as clear as that. They are to blame for both wars. Why? Because they never adapted. They never allowed the world to adapt and change. They hoarded power. They destroyed the generation that was beneath them. And they did so through capitalism and through outdated class ideals. So my argument then is that he is presenting these two characters as representative of a generation that caused wars, but also as representation of how older generations do cause problems like this. A kind of relevant thing now, I would imagine an awful lot of you are aware of the situation in our world today in which there is an older generation who you could argue are maybe making life a little bit more difficult for you in the future, denying climate change, you know, refusing to do things to make the world better and leaving you the consequences. And I think that's partly what is being argued here. Okay, so I'm going to begin by looking at these two characters and how they're set up for us. And particularly starting with the idea of Arthur Birling as a character who should know better. I'll explain what I mean here. The idea basically is that the establishment of Arthur's background is vital. Okay, now I'm largely focusing here on the idea of what's told us in those open stage directions. Now, at the level that you're all dealing with this, I really, really want to make it clear to you, you have to remember that this is a drama. This is something to be performed on stage. Therefore, those stage directions, and this is something I would expect to see from you as a marker at a high level, these stage directions are not something that the audience is aware of. They haven't read them before they go in. Okay? So although we can look at the details of stage directions, they are for the directors, for the actors. So we have to think of it in that way. So when Arthur is described as he is, as portentous, this very interesting word here, it's an indication to the actor that this is how he should come across. And any of you, and I know there are some of you in here who are involved in drama quite a bit, will know that when you actually start looking at a play and you look at these kind of stage directions, you start a discussion quite often over what that means. You quite often talk about the background of the person you're playing and think how's that going to affect who they are. Now, portentous is a word that on the surface level means too serious, trying to be too important, or trying to be very important. And that is Arthur, okay, isn't he? He doesn't have a sense of humour. And he thinks, or is trying to be, even if he doesn't think there, somebody who is a very important person in the group. Okay, so portentous describes him very well, and I think he'll come over like that to us. But there's also the idea that portentous can often refer to events or statements or signs that are important because they show something unpleasant is very likely to happen. You've probably come across it in that way before, but never thought about it. A portentous event, something that brings out portents of the future, brings out indications of where things are going to go. Now, if as Arthur, you take that on board and you think to yourself, you know, this is who Arthur is. He is literally a sign of bad stuff to come. He's a symbol of the failures of this society. He is a portent for the war and the horrors that are coming. Then that will very much inform the way that you would perform that character, wouldn't it? Okay. So think about it. Portentous, somebody who right from the beginning is a symbol of what's about to go wrong or what is already going wrong. Now, that's why his name is so important. And again, I told you about this as a drama. His name's established really quickly. Have a look at any point in the play and you'll see this. It's made very clear that his name is Birling, Arthur Birling, repeatedly, so that we will pick this up. Now, think of that name. It's not a middle-class name. Certainly not in 1912, right? Arthur is an incredibly working-class name. Okay? Think what Arthur always comes back to, King Arthur. The idea of British, salt of the earth, that kind of an idea. Okay? And Birling, again, Birling is not a name of sophistication or of, you know, showing any kind of hierarchical background. Arthur Birling could not sound working class. Drive with that name. And then he piles that accent on. Okay? Now, I've said this many times before. I was talking about this earlier today with my class, but one of the things that will be very, very obvious very quickly, remember he's the first person to speak and speaks a lot at the beginning, is that everyone else on the stage is speaking with a received pronunciation accent. They're speaking very nicely, very well. And there is him with a big, thick accent. He stands out a mile. Okay? It's a drama. This is meant to be there for us. It's vital we see that. And the fact that someone like him is a symbol of what's about to go shows us exactly how far it's gone wrong. He should have been the hope of societal change. Yeah? Because this is a man who was from the working classes and who has now made good, or so it appears to us. The background's not given to us, obviously. There's no like exposition background where it's all explained. But he should be the person who shows the way forward for society. Look, here's how we can improve life for the working classes. Here's how the world can become better. Look at him. But he isn't. He's instead a symbol of its failure. I think that's something that you can really make something of. You want to say it in as much detail as I've just done there, but it's a very, very good opening argument at a high level about him. Okay? What he should be and what he actually is. Now, of course, the other thing we're told, which will be for the casting director, is that he's in his middle 50s. I've already said it's a historical play. But if he's in his mid-50s in 1912, we're talking about somebody who's born around about 1857. So this is somebody who is very, very obviously Victorian, okay? Belongs to and grew up in Iberia. And if he did grow up in the working class, as it appears he did, the working class in the 1850s I'm sorry, the 1850s, in the 18 kind of 60s, 70s when he's growing up, was much harsher, had a much harsher life than even Eva went through. It consisted largely of unskilled labourers working in brutal and unsanitary conditions. We're talking at a time when, you know, electricity isn't necessarily always that widespread. Most of the working class here didn't have access to clean water and food, education, and proper clothing. Now, to make your way out of that is tough. And if Arthur has made his way out of that, as we would possibly believe he did, that's quite an achievement. So how has he ended up the imbecile that he is in this play? That's something that I think Priestley is posing to us to think about. How has he lost his way so much? When it adds in, and again, these are in quotes because I've taken these from research, historical documents. When we hear that working class real wages rose dramatically from the mid 1870s and mid 1890s, what it means is that he would have been earning, his earnings would have been far worse than Eva's would have been. Now, why is it significant? Well, again, I go back to the idea of the hope that he should be providing. Okay, social climbing. It should be something positive, but it's not. Because for him, his social climbing is focused around things like trying to impress Gerald's parents. He should hate Gerald's parents, shouldn't he? Gerald's parents are awful. They never appear. But think about them. Why don't they appear? Why aren't they there? They're not there because they don't approve. Because they think Gerald has married beneath him. And so they just haven't turned up to his engagement. They're awful people. But he's crawling around trying to impress them. The very first thing we see in the play is him boasting about the fact he's gone out of his way to buy the same port that Gerald's father has. I mean, what a pathetic way of trying to impress people, you know? Oh, Gerald's coming for this engagement. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll get the same kind of port his dad gets to show that I'm on a similar level. Or shall I understand? Whatever he's trying to show. He refers to them several times. The first thing he refers to is this thing that the idea they sent him a very nice cable. They couldn't be here. They sent him a very nice cable. He says, couldn't be nicer. And look at that phrasing in there. Look at what he's trying to do. They haven't turned up and they've just sent a message. A very, if it's a cable, it's a brief message, like telegram, you know. A brief message. That's all. It's a real dismissal. And look at the way he's trying to big it up. Oh, it couldn't have been nicer, what they said. Couldn't have been nicer. It's that thing, isn't it? The image of a class climber who just panders to all those people because he's allowed to be alongside them. Oh, I'm allowed at your table. Aren't I lucky? And that's the impression we get of the guy. Now, you've got to remember the historical setting at the same time. The fact that this is written in 1946, a time when it's being thought, I would imagine, that class barriers are coming down. Because in the war, which had a huge impact on the class system, you know, you had people working alongside each other for the first time, seeing that they're not very different from each other, and then coming back and you've got working class people thinking, why on earth do I have to go back to listening to that guy? I was in the trenches with him. Okay, so when you think about that situation, it's showing you how ridiculous this idea is for him. When he mentions that Lady Croft in particular thinks that Gerald could have done better for himself, again, he makes excuses for her. I don't blame her. Direct quotation. She comes from an old country family, landed people and so forth. And so it's only natural. It's natural. He's talking about the class system as natural. Something that's right. Exactly. It's how it should be. You can see what Priestley is doing here. Setting up that somebody who has come from this is essentially, to use a phrase, a class traitor. Somebody who's turned on his own class. You see, the point is, to go with that historical point I was making here about 1946, this world that he's presenting, okay, or showing us, is not the world that Priestley is presenting to us. The world that Arthur is talking about living in is not the world of and in spectacles. It's a past world. He's out of time. He doesn't belong. Okay? He's completely out of touch with the current situation. I've said before in these, and I'll say it again, about going on about the bloody Titanic, as people do. But in that speech that he gives, there are so many things in here that show he's out of touch. As well as being an idiot, he's completely out of touch. Like, for example, the Labour trouble ideas. I mentioned this in last week's as well, but it's an important point. He says, we employers are coming together to see that our interests and the interests of capital are properly protected. I mean, look at that. That is essentially Priestley referring to the rise of the trade unions. He's completely wrong, because the trade unions between 1912 and 1946 rose and took control and saw that the interests of the worker are properly looked up. That's the world his audience are living in. Okay? That's the world that's coming. But to Arthur, that's the way forward. To shut down workers. To stop them, to repress them. Regularly through the play, if you remember, he constantly goes on about this idea of lowering labour costs. It's his duty to keep labour costs down. This is being repeated to us because it's something that is really not a part of the world that Priestley is going towards us. He goes on about war. He talks about, and when he talks about war, he only really talks about the Kaiser and the German officers. So it's as though the only people involved in war are those of high class, those up, leading, in charge. He's not involved with anyone else. He's not thinking about people. And of course, having lived through the war, the audience will be more than aware that they were the people who suffer. And when he says the world is developing so fast it will make war impossible, he again is so far off the mark, it's ridiculous. Because the point is, of course, that, and he actually makes direct reference to planes and cars and ships, if you remember, as evidence of this. And of course, what did planes, cars, and ships all do? They were all a massive part of both world wars, and they were all a massive part of what made both world wars so horrific and destructive. So what he's holding up as evidence that war is impossible because the world's developing so fast. No, actually, the world is developing so fast, it makes war more dangerous, more powerful, and maybe even inevitable. He's so out of touch. He belongs to, he sees what there is, but doesn't understand it. It's like, I don't know, it'd be like listening to your granddad talking about what the internet's going to do for the future, Not understanding it. And finally, he starts to talk about the future. And again, I don't actually think I've ever seen this used in any paper I've marked. But it's so effective, so important. It's so obvious that he's put it in here. When he talks about the future, he says we're going to a time, a great future. Let's think about 1940, he says. That's loaded, isn't it, for a 1946 audience? Let's think about 1940. And he presents 1940 as a utopian age. Remember, 1940, not just in the middle of the war. What was really going on in 1940 for English people? The Blitz. They were being bombed into oblivion. Okay? Oh, yeah, 1940 is going to be a great time. So he uses that. And talks about how your son or daughter might be getting engaged, except for the fact that your son or daughter, well, your son certainly, is probably a war. It's looking ahead and seeing things completely out of range. So at the beginning, what have we got here? We've got a man who should know better. His background is so significant. We've got someone who is social climbing in a way that doesn't fit the world that he's living in, let alone the world that the play is set in. And somebody who's so out of touch with the current situation that by the time the inspector walks in, what have we got? We've got a man who we don't listen to, who we don't believe, who we don't trust, who represents somebody trying to say that they know what's going on, say that they're important, but really not understanding a word. Now, what about his wife? Well, his wife, think about her role in society. The difference with her is she's born into what she's got here. Her upbringing, think about, again, in the stage directions, that important word that she described as cold. What that means: no warmth, no humanity, no feeling whatsoever. Her class essentially is shaping her. Her behaviour before the inspector comes in that opening part, is best thought of as she's essentially her role in the house, in the dining experience, I suppose, is she is essentially like, I always think of a conductor of an orchestra. She's orchestrating the events. Right, now this happens, now this happens. This is what her job is. Yeah? No, you don't praise the cook. Right? No, don't praise the cook. Right now, Arthur, time for your famous toast of yours. No, Arthur, I don't think you ought to talk business. That's not right. That's not what should happen here. Well done, Gerald. It came just at the right moment. That was clever of you. Weren't you clever, Gerald? She takes the women out of the drawing room at the exact right moment to allow this conversation about knighthoods to take place. But as she leaves, she still says, don't keep Gerald in here too long. Again, talking down very much to her husband. All of this, it's just what should happen and what shouldn't happen. None of it's got any consequence. So what when he makes the toast? Who matter? What does it matter in the slightest bit? We calling Gerald clever for? You know? So patronising, isn't it? What I'm saying is this, that both of them belong to a world that is obviously old-fashioned to us. Even in 1912, it would have been old-fashioned. And so there's our point. So it is a generation out of time. That's the shape that goes to them. Now, once we've got that idea, once they've been shown to us to be people who don't know what's happening and who are therefore an obstacle to things, then their treatment of the lower classes through Eva particularly becomes even more significant. Okay? And mostly because everything I'm about to put up is a direct comparison, a direct contrast with Sheila and Eric, with the next generation's views. So, Arthur, as you know, views the working class as commodities, leading, as we know, to Sheila and Eric both commenting on it. You know, Sheila's, they're not, they're just, they're people. They're not cheap labour, they're people. So Arthur, even though he comes from that background himself, sees them as just like kind of commodities, units to be used. He says about his actions towards Eva, I can't take responsibility. A very interesting word. Can't, not won't. I can't, literally. What does he mean? His worldview will basically be destroyed if you take responsibility. I can't do it. If I took responsibility, everything would happen. He says, doesn't he, at one point, if we had to take responsibility for everything we had ever had anything to do, it would be very awkward, wouldn't it? That's his problem, isn't it? He can't. If he has to change his worldview, things just won't be the same. Whereas, of course, Sheila and Eric both do take responsibility. And then his judgment of Eva. Now, this is something, again, that's often missed, sorry, by people going through. Now, look, first of all, you might remember when this happens. This is after his story, when it's all gone past. He says, okay, so what happened to her next? And then he goes, get into trouble, go on the streets. That is his judgment immediately. What must have happened to her? Oh, I bet she got into trouble. I bet she ended up in prostitution, didn't she? That is literally his judgment with no evidence whatsoever. He carries on. A few pages later, he's still doing it. When he says about, when the inspector says about her having to leave the job at Millwoods, he goes, "Oh, yeah, she got herself in trouble there, I suppose." And she goes to Millwoods. That's his first thing. So again, straight away, judgment. "Oh, yeah, she got herself in trouble." And then when he's told she's sacked, "Oh, yeah, not doing her work properly." And I mean, that's a ridiculous statement to make. The one thing he said about Eva was how hard a worker she was, how good a worker she was. He's already forgotten that. And by now, his judgment is because she is somebody who didn't fit in with what he's saying, she is somebody who likely got into trouble and who likely was sacked because she wasn't working properly. Now, on the flip side, when Sybil later on comes in her story, she basically sees Eva as a different race to her. It's not even the same kind of person. Her judgment's there herself. You know, as if a girl of that sort would refuse money. Now, people often take that phrase "girl of that sort" out of context. And yeah, it can work all right. But look at what that's suggesting as well. It's not just that she's using the phrase "girl of that sort." It's the fact working class girl refusing money. Oh, she's poor. Why would she ever refuse money? Doesn't make any sense at all. She was claiming elaborate fine feelings and scruples that were simply absurd in a girl in her position. A girl in her position. Was the inspector responds to that? I'm sure you remember during it. But again, that idea, she's a different race. Look, how on earth can someone from her background have elaborate fine feelings? Just big broad feelings. She's happy or she's sad or she won't. There's nothing subtle about her. It's that thing that people often do, isn't it? Where they tend to look down on the poor, people from the past, whatever. They tend to look at them and think, well, they're not really, you know, they don't really understand. It's absurd to her. And of course, the thing where she expects deference. Deference, remember, you know, really I'm referring to that idea of, you know, people kind of almost bowing down to her and saying, "Oh, you're so great." That's what she expects from the lower classes. She constantly uses that word impertinence, constantly, which is about rudeness based on not showing the right amount of respect. She gets pretty upset at the idea of being called Mrs. Of her using her name. That's the problem. And again, it's quite it's ridiculous what she says, isn't it? Because I mean, you know, when she talks about her using her name, she says straight away, "Well, it's quite deliberate." Stupid thing to say. Doesn't just stop for a second and think about that. Really deliberate. So in walks this girl. She's come to a charity, right? She's gone out of her way to come to this charity. She's pregnant. She's on her own, and she walks in. She thinks, "I need this money desperately. What shall I do? I know. I'll take the mickey out of the woman up there." It doesn't make any sense at all. But she doesn't think that way. That's the important bit. So, not just look at the way they treat the lower classes and attach it to that idea that they're a generation out of time, but also look at how they're compared to the generation below them. Neither of whom deal with any of this. Okay? They don't judge her. They take responsibility. They don't see her as a commodity. They understand that she's of the same race, the same kind of person they are, just with different circumstances, and certainly don't expect deference. So, as we come towards the end thing here, what about the consequences of this? Well, first of all, there is a war coming. That's underlying the whole thing, certainly for the original audience, isn't it? 1912, they're told, they know, 2 years, and this whole hell starts. Any way to think about it, and you think about how the lockdowns changed a lot of our perspectives, right? How afterwards we'd see things differently. Think about how that anger then came out at people who we perceive to have, you know, exploited us in those times there. Think of all of that. And now, rather than lockdown, it's to major wars that wiped out huge chunks of society. That audience is going to be completely obsessed by the impact of that. There's a war coming, and they know what's there. It's portentous, remember? He's a portent of what's to come, Arthur. But what's he bothered about? Reputation. What the hell is, how small and unimportant is reputation going to seem to the people in that theatre? He's focused on money and capital. Well, money was certainly an issue at this point in the war, but certainly the idea of making small profits. What's that got to do with anything? And they are desperate to maintain the status quo, to not allow things to change. That's what the terror is. It's not just that the reputation thing. It is the idea that the world is going to change. That's what his speech is all about when he says you're going into a great time. Oh yeah, there's all these technological advances. But for him, the technological advances will make his life better. That's the way he's going. That's the only way he wants to see things. So the subheading of what I came to, what I originally presented to you is that this is the downfall of Arthur and Sybil Birling. That's what we see here. If they represent this out of touch generation, we are seeing them fall apart. And what do I mean by that? Well, there's a war coming. What's going to happen? Well, first of all, at the end of the play, they haven't taken their chance to change. They've been given a chance to change, and of course they don't take it. Of course they don't. So we end up sitting there thinking, what will happen to their reputation? This reputation now so desperate to protect. Well, of course, that ending suggests that whatever they're worried about, whatever they're scared of, their reputation is going to go anyway, because that second police officer is coming, and it will be real this time. Now, you take that into a broader idea, you get the sense that that means that whatever is coming, their reputation is not going to last. Now, it's, what will happen to their reputation? Sure, there's all those ideas, but again, at the same point, also, who cares? Do we really care at that point, knowing what's going to happen in those 30 years? What happened to their family? I know Arthur doesn't necessarily actually show a great family love all the way through, but it's supposedly about family for them. Well, think about it, and I think the audience will be well aware of this. Eric, first of all. Eric's in his young 20s, 1912. 2 years' time, war's going to come. Now, even if, and I'm pretty sure a character like Eric would sign up very, very quickly, don't you think? He would sign up straight away for the army. Even if he didn't, he'd be conscripted 2 years later. So he's going to war, Eric is. He's going to the First World War, and we know what happened to a lot of people in the First World War, particularly, I mentioned this before, he would be a junior officer at his class, his level, and they had the highest casualty rate of the lot. Well, basically, Eric's going to die. That's the bottom line, isn't it? Eric hasn't got long left. He's going to be dead. What about Sheila? Well, obviously, she's not going to go to war, but she's going to end up in a very different circumstance and living a very difficult life and living through both world wars. Okay? What's going to happen with Gerald? Well, a lot of people have their own conclusions. Some think that she's going to get back with Gerald or whatever. Well, Gerald's going to go to war, but I mean, Gerald will probably be fine in his class. He'll probably be an officer and get away with things. But, how will that affect the life that's coming into them? We think about their way of life that they're so keen to protect, the status quo they want to protect. What's going to happen to that? Well, we know. First of all, this obsession with business he's got. What's going to happen to his business? Oh, it's not going to survive the war, is it? Okay, certainly not in the state it's in. We know their lifestyle is going to change. We know everything about the country is going to change. It's all going to be different. So this fight that they're having here, this sacrificing of lower class people to maintain their own interests, we see is absolutely nothing. So to bring it together, it's a final conclusion. I take you back to this idea of this historical setting that we've got here, that this is 1946, looking back on 1912. And I want you to remember, therefore, it's more of a comment on what did happen at the time rather than what is going on at that moment. It's more of a look back and a saying, look at what 1912 was like. Look at what mistakes they made. Look at what they did wrong. That is why we suffered. And that's why things need to be different. People love to say, talk about this. Oh, Sheila is a symbol of hope for the future. No, she's not. It's 1946. How old is Sheila now? I'll tell you how old she is. Pretty much exactly the same age that Sybil is during the play. That's, of course, forgetting the fact she's not real. But if we just take her into the real world, for example, she's the same age Sybil is there. She didn't bring change. She didn't. Doesn't matter what she learned. Doesn't matter what she went through, what she understood. Nothing changed. The horror still came. The fire and blood and anguish still came. And Gerald, and this is quite interesting, I only noticed this recently, Gerald, of course, would be the same age as Arthur, because he's that bit older than her. In the same way that, you know, it says that there's about 5 years difference or so between Sybil and Arthur. So essentially, Gerald and Sheila, if they are together, are the same situation that Arthur and Sybil were in. Would they be the same in 1946? Or would things have changed? What would be different for them? We're invited to think out, I think. What did happen is that an older generation who had the power, who had the control, held onto it, didn't listen, didn't change. Fire, blood, brimstone, all of that coming down on you. 2 world wars. It's their fault. They were out of touch. They were out of time. They didn't step to one side and let the younger generation through. So what's he saying? The Sheilas of this world, step to one side and let's let the youth come through and let's see a better world. Not entirely sure it happened, but there we go. Okay, thank you very much.